A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. And even more powerful forms are in development.
Thank you for coming. Welcome. This is the Decision to Drop the Bomb, a presentation by Oregon PSR's Nuclear Free Program. My name is Josh Baker. I'm the Nuclear Free Program Director. Once again, a reminder, we are recording this event. Tonight's speaker, of course, is OPSR's Executive Director, Vincent Intondi, an expert on nuclear disarmament with extensive research on the intersection between nuclear weapons and race. Is the author of African Americans Against the Bomb, Saving the World from Nuclear War. And before coming to OPSR this past fall, his resume includes being a research scholar for Cornell University's Reppy Institute of Peace and Conflict Studies, Director of Research at AU's Nuclear Studies Institute, and founder and director of the Institute for Race Justice and Civic Engagement at Montgomery College. So without any further ado, Ben.
Thank you. Thanks, Josh. Thank you all for coming on tonight. There's some, obviously, like we said, some good friends here, including Bo Jacobs, who I'll be with next week, and my good friend Mel Hardy is here, such a treasure. So I just thank you all for taking the time tonight. So before I get started, I'd like to ask, you could put it in the chat, and without looking it up, who was FDR's vice president before Harry Truman? See if we got any takers. Let's see. Bo Jacobs says Wallace with a question mark, and Henry Wallace. You are correct. And I asked that because when I taught for 20 years and I had my college classes on U.S. history, I would ask this question and none of the students would know. And it's so important because so much would have been different had Henry Wallace stayed vice president. This is a crucial part in the story and in the narrative of the decision to drop the atomic bombs. And so we start there. In 1943, 1944, the Democratic Party saw that FDR was weak, physically weak from his condition, and that he probably would not make it for another term. And so the party bosses of the Democratic Party put the wheels in motions in 1944 to oust Henry Wallace, who was the vice president at the time. Now, Henry Wallace he was the Secretary of Agriculture during the New Deal. And Henry Wallace was, by all intents and measures, the most progressive vice president in United States history. He was beloved by workers and unions. He was beloved by African Americans, by feminists and women organizers. And he was absolutely hated by Wall Street. Southern whites hated him because he spoke out against racism. Male chauvinists hated him because he spoke out for women. And so they wanted to find a replacement for him. In fact, they wanted to do this before. And in a stunning letter, FDR, when he found out that they might not be able to have Henry Wallace on the ticket, wrote a letter threatening to not even run again. And it was actually Eleanor Roosevelt that tried to kind of broker a peace deal there. And so the party bosses hated Wallace and did not want him to be president. And so they found Harry Truman. Well, who was Truman? Well, let's go back to his childhood. Truman, as a kid, wore big Coke bottle glasses and used to get his butt kicked all over the playground. And he would come home and his mother would say, "That's okay, Harry. Your father always wanted a little girl, a little daughter." And his brother Vivian was the one that was the more star of the family. And so he goes off into World War I, and actually that was probably his best time as a soldier in World War I. And when he comes back to Missouri, he tries his hand in a bunch of different businesses and bankrupts most of them. He's a horrible businessman. And the Pendergast machine in Missouri were the ones that figured out they could buy him a judgeship and they could pull the strings on him. Very much like you hear about Chicago machine politics and things of this nature in Boston. It was the same thing in Missouri, and it was the Pendergast machine. And Truman, of course, had a deep-seated racism throughout his life. In fact, if you go through his letters to his wife Bess, or you go through his diaries entries, he rarely ever refers to African Americans as anything other than the N-word. In one letter to his wife Bess, he says that he thinks that black men should be in Africa, yellow men in Asia, and white people in America. And he admits it. He says, "I guess I'm race prejudiced." He brags in interviews that in his family used to get slaves as wedding presents to start out the housekeeping with. His mother openly supported the Confederacy, and when she first visited him at the White House, said she'd rather sleep on the floor than ever step foot in Lincoln's bedroom. At one point, he actually sent a $10 check to the Ku Klux Klan to become a member, and they sent it back to him because he refused to fire any Catholic workers in one of his businesses. And so there's no question that his racism played a decision. We still debate on how much of a decision it was, or how much of a factor it was in dropping the bomb. And so he works his way from a judgeship in local politics in Missouri to becoming essentially a third-rate senator in the United States Senate. And he has no moral compass. At one point in the Senate, he actually says that if Hitler is winning, we should support the Nazis. And if Stalin is winning, we should support the Russians and see what happens. And so this is the person that the party bosses have identified now that they want to be the vice president. And there is the convention. Today when we have the convention, it's a foregone conclusion of who the vice president is, right? It's a party, you nominate them, it's done. But back then, that wasn't the case. Back then, there really was all sorts of jockeying and votes and things of that nature. And so the day of the Democratic Convention on July 20th, 1944, Gallup ran a poll of likely voters, Democratic voters. 65% said they wanted Wallace to be the vice president again. 2% said they wanted Truman. And so FDR is losing his grip. He's too sick to fight for Wallace. And so he says, "I'll let the delegates figure this out." And so in 1944, the Democratic Party essentially rigs the election for Harry Truman. And this is what's now known as Pauley's coup. If you ever follow sports and you look at UCLA, the school in California, it's called the Pauley Pavilion where they play basketball. That's what it's named after, Ed Pauley. He was an oil millionaire who famously said, "It's easier to buy an entirely new Congress than to bribe the old one." And so they think the day of the convention, they got everything ready to go. And one big thing happens. They accidentally let in all of the Wallace delegates. And so right as the nomination process is beginning to start, there starts a chant. And all of the people in the crowd, all the delegates start chanting Wallace's name over and over again. Wallace, Wallace. And there's a senator, a congressman in the back of the auditorium. His name was Claude Pepper from Florida, a Democrat. They used to call him Claude Red Pepper was his nickname. Well, Claude Pepper sees what's happening, and he knows if he can get to that stage and he can get Wallace's name and nomination, he's going to be the vice president again. And then if anything happens to FDR, he'll be the president. And so as he's trying to get his way out of the crowd, he's trying to get up to that stage, the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Kelly, sees what's happening. He's hysterical, and he says there's a fire hazard, so there's too many people, and we're going to have to adjourn. So he says, he gets Chairman Senator Sam Jackson from Indiana to go up on the mic, and he says, "Motion to adjourn, say aye." Nobody says anything. Motion to continue, say aye, and all the ayes ring out. And at this point, Claude Pepper gets to the steps, and he gets to the stage, and he's 5 feet away from the microphone. And right before he gets to the microphone, they go, "There's a fire hazard, cut the power, cut the convention, we're done for the night." And they cut everything off. And the next day, all the votes are in, and they get Truman in, and he ends up becoming the vice president. And why is that important? 5 feet away from the microphone, 5 feet. Had Wallace's name gotten a nomination, he would have been the vice president again. And he would have became president when FDR died. and he hated the atomic bomb. There would have been no atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There would have been no invasion of Vietnam. There would have been no Cold War. The entire course of human history could have been changed in those 5 feet. And if you asked any of my students, nobody knows that this even happened. It's completely erased out of our history. And instead, we get Harry Truman. And so on April 12th, President Truman is brought to a room at the White House. He's over at the Capitol drinking and hanging out with senators, and they rush him over. And he goes to the White House, and Eleanor Roosevelt greets him there, and she says, "Harry, the president is dead." And Truman was so stunned, he almost passed out. He composes himself, and he says to Eleanor, "Is there anything I can do for you?" And she says, "Oh, no, Harry, is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one who's in trouble now." And he noted later that he began to cry, thinking about, quote, the awful responsibility. When he got sworn in, he said, "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now." When he became president, he said, quote, "I feel like the moon and the stars and all the planets had fallen on me." He said, "I felt like I was struck by lightning." And he told Senator George Aiken of Vermont, quote, "I'm not big enough for this job." One reporter yelled out to him, "Good luck, Mr. President." And he turned around and responded and said, "I wish you didn't have to call me that." And then earlier that evening, Secretary of War, Secretary of Defense, Henry Stimson tells now President Truman that the U.S. is building the most destructive weapon in all of human history. Now, why is that important? That's the first time Truman is hearing about this. That tells you 2 things. One, that the idea that Truman thought this was just another weapon of war doesn't hold up. He's being told right out of the gate, this is the most destructive weapon in all of human history. The second is FDR so little trusted Truman, he never even told him that we were building the bomb. This is the first time he's hearing about it. So the questions become now, why develop the bomb? Well, as many of you know, the bomb was originally developed to stop Germany. 2 German scientists split the atom in December of 1938. And when word gets to US scientists, they realize the ability to make the atomic bomb now is possible. And the most concern of European scientists who escaped Hitler was the fear that Hitler would create the bomb, and they wanted to get it to stop him. It was never intended to be used on Japan. But by the spring of 1945, remember, we dropped the bomb in August of 1945. By the spring of 1945, Hitler was dead and the Nazis were defeated. And who did the heavy lifting in that? The Soviet Union. Whether we like it or not, that is the reality. 27 million dead. They had the most killed. They did the yeoman's work in this war. The second front comes much later, after they were already pushing the Nazis and had already defeated them by themselves. In fact, it was future President John F. Kennedy that said no nation in the history of war ever suffered more than the Soviet Union in World War II. And so now Truman is faced with the biggest decision of his presidency, arguably the biggest decision of mankind. He writes in his 1955 memoirs that on the first full day of his presidency, Secretary of State Jimmy Burns told him, quote, "The U.S. is building an explosive great enough to destroy the entire world." On April 25th, 1945, Secretary of War Defense Henry Stimson and Brigadier General Leslie Groves again give him a lengthy briefing telling him that if he uses the atomic bomb, that modern civilization will be completely destroyed. And when he first is briefed on the Trinity test on July 25th, 1945, the results of the atomic bomb test, he writes, quote, "It may be the fire destruction prophesied in the Euphrates Valley era after Noah and his fabulous ark." That's what he's comparing it to. So the idea that Truman didn't know what he was doing, again, doesn't hold up. And Truman nevertheless authorized the use of the atomic bombs against Japan, always insisting, up to the day he died, never feeling remorse, and even bragging that he never lost any sleep over the decision. And so one of the things that always comes up in this narrative is that we had to do this because it saved millions of lives. Had we gone into ground invasion, the Japanese would have fought to the death. They had kamikaze pilots. They would have never stopped. And therefore, this saved millions of lives. The reality is that the U.S. War Department did its own study at the time before the bomb was dropped of how many casualties there could be based on where the Japanese military was at this point, and they came up with a number of 46,000. Now, some numbers went a little bit higher and a little bit lower. 46,000, nowhere near the millions of numbers. So where did this number come from and why did they feel this way? Well, remember, before the bomb was ever dropped, you had an island hopping campaign and a firebombing campaign. In fact, on March 9th and 10th of 1945, Curtis LeMay sent 334 planes to attack Tokyo. They were using incendiary bombs that consisted of napalm and thermite and white phosphorus and other inflammable materials. In fact, we were killing so many people that future Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, who was on LeMay's staff in 1945, agreed with his boss that if we lost the war, we would be tried as war criminals and deserve to be convicted. In fact, Secretary of Defense Stimson had actually said to Truman, I don't want to outdo Hitler in the number of atrocities. That's how many people we were killing with firebombing campaign before the bomb was ever dropped. The Japanese military was brutal. There's no question about that. Nobody is saying they shouldn't have been stopped. They absolutely needed to be stopped. The point is they were stopped before the bomb was ever dropped, and we knew that. And that's something that's very important. How do we, and we'll talk about how we know it. By the end of 1944, Japanese Navy was decimated. They had lost 7 of 12 battleships, 19 of 25 aircraft carriers, 103 out of 160 subs, 31 out of 47 cruisers, and 118 out of 158 destroyers. We don't ever look at this narrative from the point of view of the victims. When we grow up in this country, we always look at it from the point of view of the Enola Gay. So we look at it and say it was the right thing to do. It ended the war quicker. It saved millions of lives. All of this is not true. And again, we know this now because over time we have Soviet sources, we have Japanese sources, so we now know. And after the Battle of Saipan in July of 1944, the Japanese were hoping they were going to get one more heavy casualty battle against the United States, inflict heavy casualties, and then they could negotiate a better surrender term. But that didn't happen. They knew they were militarily defeated. And how do we know? Because we started intercepting their messages. We cracked their code. And so we were looking at the foreign minister Togo in Tokyo and Ambassador Sato in Moscow. We were looking at what they were saying. And in fact, the former prime minister at one point sends a letter to the emperor in the summer of 1945 saying, quote, I regret to say that Japan's defeat is inevitable. They knew they were done. If you look at other messages, the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Summary of the Week in the summer said that it may be said that Japan now officially, if not publicly, recognizes her defeat. Another Japanese memo we intercept says, quote, Japan is deeply reluctant to have any further blood lost on both sides. It is his desire for the welfare of humanity to restore peace with all possible speed. Over and over again, Truman is being told that Japan is looking for a way out of this war. They are militarily defeated before the bomb was ever dropped. And so the next piece you have to ask yourself is, were there ways to end the war sooner without the bomb? And the answer is yes. The first thing we could have done is demonstrate it. We could have shown them this is what's waiting for you if you do not surrender. But the biggest thing is we could have changed the surrender terms. So Japan, knowing they were militarily defeated, the problem was FDR in Casablanca in front of Churchill made a mistake and talked about unconditional surrender, which would mean trying the emperor, removing the Japanese emperor. And so General Douglas MacArthur told Truman that in the summer of 45, that if you change the surrender terms and let them keep the emperor, we can end this war. But if you go in with unconditional surrender, then we're going to have to try the emperor and kill him, and they will die like ants for him. It would be like crucifying Christ in the United States. But we can end this now. But no, Truman says no, unconditional surrender no matter what. And the rub, of course, is after the war, we let them keep the emperor anyways. So we could have ended this had we changed the surrender terms. And so why was this, if we know this, why was it actually used? It was used for revenge for Pearl Harbor. It was used to flex our muscles to the Soviet Union. And it was used because of Truman's own deep-seated racism. Soviet entry is what ended this war, not the atomic bomb. Now, if you think about that, if we come to terms and admit that the Soviet entry into the Pacific is what ended this war, not the atomic bomb, that changes the narrative completely. And we know that, and so did Truman. In fact, when Stalin confirms that he's coming into the Pacific, Truman writes, quote, "Stalin will be in Jap war on August 15th. Finny Japs when that comes about." He knew it. Truman tells his wife, "The Soviets are coming into the war and now it will end at least a year sooner." Our own intelligence estimate on June 30th, the War Department stated, quote, "The entry of the Soviet Union into the war will finally convince the Japanese of the inevitability of complete defeat." This is what the Japanese feared the most. They saw what the Red Army did to the Nazis, and this is what ultimately made them throw up their hands in defeat. On April 11th, 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff says, quote, "When the USSR comes in, they are done," meaning the Japanese. The Japanese intelligence, another message we intercepted, says that, quote, "If the Soviet Union comes in, it will be the death blow to our empire." And in fact, the Soviet invasion proved far more powerful than anything of the atomic bombs. When the Soviet Union went in, that is when the surrender happened. In fact, after we dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima, instantly killing hundreds of thousands of people, the War Council in Japan said that we think there's 100 more in Tokyo is next, and they still voted to keep the war going. It was the Soviet Union that ultimately brought them to their knees. The other piece of this, of course, is Truman knew what he was doing. Truman knew what this weapon was, and he knew the process he was going to put in place. And it's because of that decision that we all live now with the real fact on all of days, World Cancer Day, where tomorrow the last nuclear treaty that we had with the US and Russia is gone and we're on the brink of an all-out arms race. This could have been prevented, and Truman knew it, and he did it anyways. In his own military, these are not peace doves. The own military was telling him not to do it. In fact, Admiral William Leahy, who chaired the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and served as Truman's personal chief of staff, said, quote, "It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon in Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender. My own feeling was that being in the first to use it, we adopted an ethical standard to the barbarians of the Dark Ages." Dwight Eisenhower, quote, "I voiced to Truman my grave misgivings. First, on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and dropping the atomic bomb was completely unnecessary. I hated to see our country be the first to use such a weapon." Air Force Chief of Staff General Henry Arnold, quote, "It always appeared to us that atomic bomb or no atomic bomb, the Japanese were on the verge of collapse." General Curtis LeMay, who oversaw the firebombing campaign, "Even without the atomic bomb, with Russian entry into the war, Japan would have surrendered in 2 weeks." Brigadier General Bonner Fellers wrote, quote, "Neither the atomic bombing or entry of the Soviet Union into the war forces Japan's unconditional surrender. She was already defeated before any of these events even took place." I could go on and on with the amount of military folks that advised Truman that this was not necessary and not to do it. And yet Truman always accepted personal responsibility for this. We talk now, did he really give the order? Was it the military and it was already in place and it was a runaway train? Well, according to President Truman, quote, he wrote, "The final decision of where and when to use the atomic bomb was up to me. Let there be no mistake about it. I regarded the bomb as a military weapon and never had any doubt that we should use it." Again, in 1948, he writes a letter to his sister Mary, and he says, "I made the decision to drop the atomic bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a terrible decision, but I made it." When an interviewer asked whether the decision was morally difficult to make, he responded, quote, "Hell no, I made it like that." And he snapped his fingers. When he meets with Edward R. Murrow for an interview and asked if he had any regrets, quote, "Not the slightest in the world." And when he, of course, this was a scene that was in the Oppenheimer film. So when J. Robert Oppenheimer is feeling so guilty about what happened, and he meets with the president and he says, "Mr. President, I feel like I have blood on my hands." Truman says, "If there's any blood, it's on my hands." And then famously, "Get this crybaby son of a bitch scientist out of my office. I never want to see him again." And at one point, Truman is he's in this happy mood now, and he's at a party with Churchill after all of this. And Churchill comes up to him and he says in front of everybody, "Mr. President, I hope you have an answer ready for that hour when you and I stand before St. Peter." And he says, "I understand you two are responsible for putting off those atomic bombs. What do you have to say for yourself?" And Truman gets all flushed and he doesn't know what to do and he's embarrassed. And Robert Lovett, his Secretary of Defense at that point, intervened and saved him. And until his death in December of 1972, he never regretted the decision. And in fact, in 1958, he wrote a letter to the Hiroshima City Council confirming that he would order the bomb to be used again on Japan. And he said, quote, "We'll send it airmail and we'll make sure there's enough stamps on it." That's the Harry Truman that you don't see in the popular movies and in the popular books that you can buy. And so one of the things that happens when you look at this narrative, when we look at this, is what I've always gotten in debates and at social media, and for all the years I've talked about this and lectured on this and researched this, is that if you question the decision to use the bomb, you are somehow insulting the troops. You are somehow doing something bad, or you're talking bad about somebody's grandfather maybe that served. And that's simply not the case. The reality is you can still commemorate and admire on what U.S. soldiers, the sacrifices they made to defeat fascism, and at the same time have an honest assessment and be critical about the decision to use the bomb. The other piece is that if you're doing this, you're somehow letting the Japanese off for Pearl Harbor or defending their atrocities. Absolutely not. Again, the Japanese military were horrific and they absolutely needed to be defeated. The point is they were already defeated before the bomb was ever dropped. And in fact, if you ever go to Nagasaki, there is a museum, the Oka Masaharu Museum in Nagasaki. And for years when I taught in Japan and would travel there with students, I would bring students to this museum. And it is a private museum in Nagasaki about what the Japanese did to other countries. Think about that, right? So I would have my Japanese students and my Chinese students holding hands, walking through this museum and seeing comfort women and the rape of Nanjing and all of these things happening. And I'm crying and apologizing to each other. Do we have anything like that in the United States to reckon with what we have done, right? Look at the Vietnam War Memorial. There are the names of 58,000 U.S. soldiers that died, but nowhere in this country, not a single place in this country do we have any mention of the 3.8 million Vietnamese that were slaughtered in that war. If those names were on that wall, it would be 10 miles long. Maybe we would think differently about the issue of peace and war. We love to celebrate war in this country, but not peace, right? And so another question I would get often is, well, we don't have Japanese sources, so how do you know this stuff? Wrong. We do have Japanese sources. We have the magic that I just read from you. We have statements from the emperor, from the military, from former prime ministers. So there are actually Japanese sources that we can look to. Again, the issue of fighting from the death in what they were trying to do as far as ground invasion numbers. And so where does the number of that it saved millions of lives come from? Well, so we know that our own estimates were nowhere near that number. After John Hersey's famous book Hiroshima came out and dramatically changed the way citizens looked at the atomic bomb, they no longer looked at it just as infrastructure being destroyed, but human beings, right? That book was so profound. Well, when that started to change the minds of people, it was Secretary of War Stimson that then came out in 1947 and said the bomb saved 1 million lives with no factual proof. President Truman said it saved 500,000 lives with no proof. Then George H.W. Bush in 1991, when asked about the atomic bomb, said, quote, it saved millions, plural, of lives. In 1995, crew members of the Enola Gay were asked about this and said that it saved 5 million lives. the numbers just keep going up without any factual basis, right? But we have that when you tell something often enough and frequent enough, it becomes truth. So when I get into these conversations on social media, what I will always get back is that you're apologizing for Japan, you're pro-Russia, which can't be further from the truth, that these numbers you don't have your facts, even when I'm providing the actual sources that I'm stating here and quoting. One that I will often get is, well, didn't the emperor mention the atomic bombs in his surrender statement? That is the one point that everybody will throw at you on social media for this narrative. But the reality is when you start to dig on that, Lieutenant Colonel Takeshita wrote this statement in his diary. None of the participants who attended the imperial conference of the surrender remembers the emperor saying anything like this, and it's not mentioned in the imperial rescript. So the idea that the emperor stated this, again, is not factual. So if we now look at this and we say that the bomb did not end the war, did not save millions of lives, was not needed to end the war, didn't end it quicker, then what does that say about nuclear weapons in the atomic bomb? How does that change things, right? Then you realize that it's morally reprehensible and militarily not needed, right? Even today, they're not needed. And so this history has been, we're trying to, again, with our research with people like Bo and others, put this research out there because we have the sources, but it's so difficult because you have a narrative that for so long has been in place. And it is so hard to get people to realize that that narrative is wrong. And the idea to say that if you are truthful about this narrative, that you're not anti-US, anti-military, that's not the case. You're just trying to get at the truth. And how does this alter how we look at the bomb and nuclear weapons? Henry Wallace actually ends up running against Truman on the Progressive Party ticket when he runs again. And he's getting support from, especially from the Black community. And so it's Thomas Dewey on the right, and you have Truman running on the Democratic ticket, and then you have Wallace in the Progressive Party. And right at the last second, Truman says that if he's elected, he'll put a complete civil rights package to Congress to pass so he could get the Black vote and defeat Henry Wallace. And it worked. And of course, he never delivered on civil rights, only desegregating the military. And Henry Wallace, he keeps him on as Secretary of Commerce, but Henry Wallace will not stay quiet about his criticism of using the atomic bomb. And so he's eventually in Truman's next term is fired. And so the idea of there are these moments in our history of had Henry Wallace been the president when FDR died, had JFK not been assassinated, had RFK not been assassinated, what would have changed, right? How would history have been different? And so it is these stories that for years I would tell my students to get them engaged in history and to understand it's not just about the memorizing of facts in a standardized test. It's real people at stake here. And what does it matter when these things happen? So I'll stop there so we can have a discussion for the next 15, 20 minutes, answer any questions that I didn't answer for you, provide any sources for you, and we can go from there. Josh, I'll let you kind of pick people out for questions. I don't know if there's things in the chat I haven't had a chance to look. So thank you.
And just so everybody knows, continue to put questions in the chat, raise your hand, whatever. So a question from Patrick. It's a two-part question. So if Japan was defeated, what explains the delay of the surrender? And if the Soviets had gone to Japan, Japan would have become Soviet. So is that a rationale for it?
No, it's not a rationale for it. It's not picking, it's the reality is that if we're trying to determine why did they surrender, was the bomb the reason they surrendered? It's not. Because we know from sources, Japanese sources, they surrendered because they feared the Russians coming into the Pacific. So that's all. I'm not pro the Russians going in or what would have happened. It's just the reality that it was the Russians going in that caused the war to end. And the first part was, why did it take so long? That gets back to, they were trying to negotiate surrender terms. They did not want unconditional surrender. So they were putting out peace feelers, and they were trying to figure a way out of this without having to, take out the emperor. And again, in the end, even for all this bluster of unconditional surrender, they let them keep the emperor anyways. After we start this process of an arms race, and after we kill hundreds of thousands of people, we still let them keep the emperor. So again, it wasn't needed.
I guess this kind of follows up on what you were talking about, but in a letter by Truman that he wrote to the Atlantic a couple of years after dropping the bomb, he argued that the fact that he says that Japan was given fair warning and were offered terms that they finally accepted in advance of dropping the bomb. And so he believes that the bomb caused them to accept these terms. Do you find there to be any validity to any of that?
No, I don't. I don't think they were warned. But this is typical. I mean, we were also told that Hiroshima was a military target. It wasn't. It was in pristine condition. It hadn't been hit in the firebombing, and it was mostly civilians. So the idea that we were going tit for tat with Pearl Harbor and so on and so forth. No, we hit civilians. We did it on purpose. And I see just now popping up why Nagasaki, because it was a new bomb, it was the plutonium bomb. And so let's try that out as well. And see, and again, let's make sure we flex our muscles to the Soviets. Truman, when you look at him, even in video, you can look, when he's with Churchill and he's with Stalin, you can tell he's timid and he doesn't know how to carry himself. But once he gets word that they have the bomb, that he has the bomb, the test, oh, now he's out. Chest is out now. Now he's arrogant. Now he's the big man on campus, and tells Stalin we have it. And of course, Stalin already knew. He had his spies. He didn't know how fast we had it, but he knew. So he goes back and says, you need to speed up the process. And that's where the arms race begins, right? So we drop it in 45. The Russians get it in 49. We develop the hydrogen bomb in 52. They get it in 53. And now a full arms race is on. And again, it didn't need to happen.
So going back to what you have said about Truman and how he didn't seem to display any kind of regret whatsoever, has there been any indication that could have been some sort of public persona and he maybe did display it in private? I know you mentioned that he seemed to be embarrassed about a comment about it, but is there any indication that was kind of publicly justifying his decisions?
There are those that have said that he, had made comments or maybe struggled or hated to, kill so many people. There's also, you have to juxtapose this with bad Gary Sinise films or, the kind of biography you'll see at Barnes and Nobles. Now, I know Alex Wellerstein just wrote a book on Truman. I have not read it yet. I don't know if it's sympathetic or what have you. I don't know the sources on it and things of this nature. But when you look at Truman's history of clearly being racist, right? I mean, you can't deny his writings, he threatens to use nuclear weapons again in Korea. So this isn't a one-off. He threatens to use them again in the Korean War. I find it hard to believe that, he all of a sudden has a moral compass and feel sad about this. JFK, we know now, when JFK, when he put somebody in harm's way and when the pilots are killed in the Cuban Missile Crisis, he broke down on his hands and knees, sobbing in front of Jackie in the bedroom. He felt it. And I don't believe for a second that was in Truman's DNA. Now, again, don't believe me. Do your own thinking. Do your own research on this. There's enough books out there and, sources, and I'd be more than happy to, if you want to reach out to me individually, I'll give you all my sources, all my books. I mean, they're pretty much all behind me. But there's enough archives now. And that's the thing, that over time, we have now gotten access to Russian archives. We've gotten access to Japanese archives. And that has changed how we look at things. And we have to be able to admit that we can change how we think of things when more evidence is out there. But in a world today in which facts are just deemed, alternative and disinformation is spread so much, it is so important that we have this, that we maintain the truth about this narrative and what happened, because this is the starting point. If you don't know the history of dropping the bomb, tough to start working on all the other nuclear issues if you don't know that history, right? But I mean, I can tell you that the biggest place for this debate is when I go on to, I put the generals that I read to you, all their comments about not using the bomb. I put that on Instagram, each picture of those generals with their exact quotes. The good news is it has over 5 million views, hundreds of thousands of likes, but I can tell you there's probably 250,000 comments, and the amount of comments that say this is not true, that I'm glad the Japanese died, more debt, like it's unbelievable what comes out of this. I mean, but it reflects what was at the time. I mean, again, a week after the atomic bombing, Gallup ran a poll. 85% of the American public agreed with Truman's decision to use nuclear weapons. 22.4% of the American public wished that Japan hadn't surrendered so we could have killed more people. No poll up until late October in 1945 ever showed more than 4.5% of the American people questioning or being critical of Truman's decision. And that's because we had a genocidal race hatred against the people of Japan, unprecedented in our nation's history. Far worse than the hatred we showed towards people of Middle Eastern descent after 9/11, or Asian descent with COVID, or Hispanic people now. The Japanese were, after Pearl Harbor, were all viewed as monkeys and apes and roaches and yellow vermin, because if you can reduce people to being less than human, it makes it easier to commit violence against them. So we weren't dropping the bomb on mothers and fathers and sons and daughters. We were dropping it on vermin, on roaches, on monkeys, right? And that's why John Hershey's book was so important, could have put a human face on this, right? It's the same thing we see today when the Palestinian people are being referred to as animals, right? When they're not fully human because they don't look like us or talk like us or act like us or smell like us, then the translation is they're not really human. They're not one of us. When you make that jump and you say that now Hispanic people are, quote, aliens, you're saying they're not human beings. And so it's easier to say, okay, we're going to just kill them in the streets right now or put them in internment camps like we did with the Japanese. So this is not new. Of course, it dates all the way back to slavery and how we depicted the African people in the transatlantic slave trade. But this is no different than we did here, which is why you saw such a hatred in the response after we dropped the bombs, and still today in many cases.
All right. We have some questions here. First was from Bo Jacobs. Bo, if you want to unmute real quick.
Yeah. Thanks for a brilliant presentation, and thanks especially for bringing the receipts. Actually, I think I have to, which I'll go and do in a Zoom way, lower my hand, because I think you already answered my question, which was I was going to ask if you had a response to the Wellerstein book. Having just come out, of course, I wouldn't assume you'd have read it by now, and I haven't read it by now. I've simply heard a few interviews and read a few interviews, but that's what I was going to ask you. And I think in a lot of ways, you've talked as much as anyone could talk to the point without having gotten down into the book itself. So thanks. But so I'll pass on to people who have better questions, which I see. But one of the things that I really think that is important that you bring up is this, which has just always struck me as completely unexplored, is this ambiguity of this period of time during which the U.S. knew absolutely the Japanese government was looking for conditional surrender. And I forget the exact timing of when the decision was made to retain the emperor, to not kill the emperor. But that space in there where the decision had been made to accept a conditional surrender in de facto, but not to say the words conditional surrender. How many American soldiers lost their lives during that period of time, and at whose hands were they? So there's just a lot of exploration in that space. I appreciate you bringing it up.
Thanks, Bo. I mean, even when we look at just the whole narrative of World War II, I mean, Stalin was begging for help. Again, this is not a defense of Stalin. He's a monster. I mean, look at what he did in Ukraine, of course. But he knew what Hitler was capable of. He knew what they were doing. But Churchill hated communism more than fascism. And he was like, no, we're not. Churchill's saying we're not in this war to give up territory. We need to maintain our Northern African colonialism and empire and so on and so forth. He was begging for help. So D-Day comes far too late. By that time, the Battle of Moscow, Stalingrad, these things had already happened. And the march was going, now the Soviets were marching. And so it's just this heroic narrative that doesn't hold up. And the minute you try to question it, you are un-American. And that's just, it's this binary thing the way we look. It's good and bad. It's capitalism, communism, and and the reality is with history, it's gray, right? There's multiple sides to things. That's why I was always telling my students when you get to the Cuban Missile Crisis, if you look at it from the point of view of the U.S., it's going to be really different if you look at it from the point of view of the Cubans. And it's going to be really different if you look at it from the lens of Khrushchev. And it's only until you look at all those perspectives, then you can put it together and come up with your own opinion. That's why I would always press upon students. Instead of just kind of just taking what's given to you and force fed to you, whether it's through, K through 12 or, again, some movie that that doesn't have all the facts straight.
Well, bravo.
Up next, we have a question from Melvin Hardy.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Vin. The perspective that might come from the creatives or the creative class that might look at this history or look at a different perspective on the advance to a more global pluralism or global respect for others, not discounting the evils that humans know how to create, under systems or leaders who govern without that moral compass. Could you speak to the role that creatives might have played in giving us a new compass toward a world that is free from, let's just piece part it, or free from nuclear weapons? You write very brilliantly about this as well.
Yeah, I mean, it was, immediately, if you look at it, it was, before any really organized peace movement came about, it was the faith community, Fellowship of Reconciliation, War Resisters League, Quakers, members of the Catholic Church. It was also the Black community. It was pacifists. You did have people that were immediately coming out. The danger to do that, though, in the United States was Truman made it very clear. Because again, think about this. We're very close now to HUAC and McCarthyism. And so to what happens in Truman's second term, where he surrounds himself with yes men, and now to be anti-nuclear means you are pro-communist. That's the translation. So to speak out against nuclear weapons could mean you are deported, arrested, beaten, fired from your job, blacklisted. That's what it meant. So there were real consequences for folks to come out against this, but they saw what was in place. I mean, think about where we are right now, right? So New START is going to expire tomorrow. And the policy that is in place, as many of you know, the system in place is that as we speak right now, President Trump can say, I want to end life on the planet, or I want to completely remove Iran from the planet. And he will take out of his breast pocket of his suit coat a set of codes. And there is an officer that is with him at all times with what's called the nuclear football, which is a briefcase with a computer in it. And he will then put the codes in of where he wants to destroy, who he wants to destroy, and his codes. Those codes then get punched in and they go to a missile silo in Montana or Nebraska or North Dakota, somewhere in that range, where there's probably 2 kids that are in their 20s. Looking at these codes and saying, is this the President of the United States? They verify it. They verify the codes. They turn their keys, and in 20 minutes, whatever country he chose or the entire planet no longer exists. That's the process. There's no congressional approval. No military person's going to stop him. The process that Truman put in place is what we have today. It's because of that process that Truman put in place that we all live with the real possibility of dying from nuclear war. And he knew what it was, and he knew we didn't need to do it, and yet he did it anyways.
So we have a question from Norma here. Says the more that she learns about the history, the more she can't help but seeing an experimental imperative at work, along with other factors you and others have laid out, specifically the desire to see what this new tool can do, and asks, do you see the list of cities to be kept pristine from aerial bombings so that the effect of A-bombs can be properly seen as an instance or evidence of this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when you look at, you can only firebomb so many countries or from island hopping that you don't have anything left. I mean, we were, destroying so many countries. So, the experimentation that you're talking about or the testing, proof is in the pudding after the bomb was dropped. So after the bomb is dropped, the US now starts taking kids, especially young girls from Japan, victims, survivors of the atomic bomb, and using them as guinea pigs. So what they created was what's known as the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. And they would go and they would take young kids, junior high, what have you, and put them in Jeeps from school, bring them to this place, put them on a stage, and poke them and prod them and study them as guinea pigs. That place is now called the RERF. And I used to take students there when I was at American University, and I hated it because it still, to me, has such a creepy factor. There's lab coats, and they still try to downplay radiation exposure, and I just hate the whole thing. And one year, we took Coco Kondo Tenemoto, Coco Tenemoto Kondo, who is John Hersey's daughter and one of the youngest survivors of the atomic bomb, and a very, very dear friend of mine. And we took her there. She's with us usually on the entire trip. And she had never been inside the auditorium since she was a little girl. And we asked her if she wanted to go, and she did. And she went in and sat on the edge of that stage and retold her story of that part of her experience. And she said, the auditorium now looks so small compared to when she was a little girl and what it looked like, to be up there by herself, stripped naked and being studied. And so the fact for these survivors was we couldn't even live with dignity. It was bad enough we were being told that we were contagious, that we had atomic bomb disease. If men found out you couldn't bear children, you were discriminated against. You represented loss. There was the physical aspects of this. And now you were being studied. It never helped. They didn't give you medical care. They just studied you as a guinea pig. And when they were done with the Japanese, we did it to our own soldiers. We had atomic veterans that came back from World War II. We sent them out to Nevada, didn't tell them what it was for, and tested nuclear weapons on them and never protected them. Our own veterans. So the experimentation that you mentioned essentially has no bounds when it comes to the U.S.
We have a question from Mary asking if there was a separate consideration or decision to drop the bomb on Nagasaki, or if it was all part of the initial discussion. And did Leslie Grove have greater agency in that decision? Groves, sorry.
So I don't know. I can't speak definitively on that. What I can tell you about Nagasaki is that they don't drop it on Nagasaki. They drop it on right outside because of the wind patterns and weather that day. They drop it right outside in what's called the Urakami district. And they drop the bomb and destroy the largest, they drop it on the largest Christian population in the country. And they destroy the largest Christian church in the country. So imagine, first of all, how sick and twisted you have to be to do that, right? And secondly, the people there that believe in a higher power, and then are trying to mentally compartmentalize this and say, but why did this happen? Why would you drop this on us? And that's another thing that, we get into. Nagasaki is very different when you visit there versus Hiroshima. Hiroshima, I've always been there on the 6th and the 9th for both, and Hiroshima is much more popular. Nagasaki, I think their museum is better. Nagasaki, I think doesn't shy away from blaming or who did it, the US, versus in Hiroshima, they don't really talk about that. It's just pretty much never again. And I think that's a mistake. I think that the only way to reckon with this is to admit that we did this. We are the only country that dropped nuclear weapons, right? Us. And so who are we to tell other countries if they can or can't have them, even though I don't want any country to have them, right? Who are we to dictate that? It's us. So we should be leading by example. We should be the ones leading on the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons instead of going the opposite way.
Going through, I believe that is all the questions. I want to thank everybody for the questions and comments that they put in the chat, and everyone that spoke on mic. Really appreciate that. A reminder of some upcoming events. Of course, Vin will be in Corvallis this weekend, and we also have a string of documentaries that we are participating in or co-sponsoring, including two this Sunday, The Other Side of the Hill at Havura Shalom and Samud at Cinema 21. In addition to the documentary down in Eugene this coming Wednesday, Silent War, The Shadow of the Atomic Bomb, and screening of Half-Life of Memory, also down at U of O. That would be on Wednesday, February 25th. And that same night in Portland, we are co-sponsoring a 350 PDX action night on tear gas, where the documentary Gas Me Teddy will be screened. And the day after that, on February 26th, a screening of 100 Years from Mississippi will be at Reed College Performing Arts Building. So I believe that is all the questions, comments. Vin, any final thoughts?
Just want to thank you, first of all, obviously, for attending. I know there's so many other things that you could be doing and attending. And secondly, I see Rachel is on here and Bo is on here, and the three of us will be having a panel discussion at University of Oregon next week. So I hope that you all can attend that, because if you haven't read Bo's book, please, I recommend reading it. If you're not familiar with Mel Hardy's work in the art world and the Hiroshima children's drawings and what he's doing at the Carter School at George Mason, you should definitely look him up. He's a treasure. So I just want to thank everybody for coming. And if you want to reach out to me, I'm on the website, easy to find. Anything, any other questions, sources, anything at all, please don't be a stranger. I just want to thank you again.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much. Have a good night.
Thank you, Ben.